Once again, want to welcome everyone here and our visitors also. We are so thankful that you're here and want to invite you back at any opportunity that you have. Tonight, our guest speaker is one that we've known and he's spoken to us before, especially this morning, brought two great lessons from apologetics. I think it's so important and advantageous for us all to study these Christian evidences because it's what we need to know to help people get back to understanding that the Bible is inspired. And he did a great job with the gospel and also the resurrection. And look forward to your lesson on the problem or the answer to pain or evil or suffering. And I don't know if I got it all right, but I know it's to evil. And so Aaron has spent the last 2.5 years as an associate minister at the West Broward Church of Christ. I think that's in Fort Lauderdale. Wow. And he and his wife now, Jacqueline, they live in Colorado, where he's pursuing a full-time work with the Daily Apologist as a speaker, writer, and media creator. He's very good. He has a BA in Biblical Studies from the Bear Valley Bible Institute there in, I guess, outside Denver. And so we want to welcome him back, and also if you get a chance to meet him afterward, it's a joy. Please come speak to us the Word of God.
Well, good evening, everyone. As Jeff just mentioned, we are going to be looking at perhaps the most powerful objection to Christianity in particular and to theism in general, and that is the problem of evil. Rather than me explaining in academic terms what this problem is, I would like to read for you an anecdote from C.S. Friedman, who is Jewish, that concerns her reflections on the Holocaust. She says, quote, "I have had many friends who pray to Jesus for trivial things, minor daily trials, some of whom honestly believe that God is constantly doing small things to make their lives easier, like helping them get a job interview or healing their children. I've given up trying to explain why that very concept is offensive to Jews. If God exists and he cares enough to ease the fever of a little kid with the flu, then what was up during the Holocaust? Weren't enough little kids suffering back then? Someone once asked me what I would do if I found out that I was wrong in my atheism. And when I died, I found myself standing before the throne of God for judgment. What would I say to God then? I answered, where were you in 1943? If he exists, he owes us an explanation. People often ask how I can call myself Jewish and be an atheist. My answer is that for many of us, that is the only way we can be Jewish. If you've lived life for very long, then you have become personally acquainted with the problem of evil. Whether it is moral evil, the consequences of decisions that other people have made, horrible things that people do to each other, or whether it is natural evil, the consequences of the laws of nature, of gravity, ice storms, disease. You can't live in this world very long and not come face to face with the problem of evil. If God exists, why does he allow these bad things to happen? And so one of the primary tasks of Christian apologetics is to offer an answer to this problem, to show that belief in God can still be rational, even in a world that is enveloped in evil. And to do this effectively, it's important to understand that this problem comes in two major different forms: the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. The intellectual problem of evil has to do with premises lead to a like, therefore God probably does not exist. So we can just intellectually deal with the premises and see the emotional problem has to do with one's emotional investment with the idea of God existing in a world with as much evil as we observe. And so when talking with people, it's important to be able to distinguish which one they are talking about. Are they talking about the intellectual or the emotional problem? Looks like we might have a problem with the microphone. Okay. You want me to just step in here?
Just put it in your pocket.
Perfect. Well, good evening, everyone. We need to be able to distinguish between the intellectual problem and the emotional problem. And you don't want to ask the person, are you referring to the intellectual problem of evil, or are you just having an emotional reaction, right? That's not the question that you want to ask. You just want to be able to feel kind of where this person is coming from, right? Maybe someone brings up the problem of evil, and instead of answering it, you say, you know, it's really interesting that you would choose that particular objection. Why is it that out of all of the objections that you selected that one? And that might help you get beneath the surface and actually have a real conversation as opposed to just talking about it on the surface. Because if you try to deal with the intellectual problem in emotional terms, then the person is just going to be left rather unimpressed and unsatisfied. But on the flip side, if you try to deal with the emotional problem in intellectual terms, well, then you're going to come off as cold and uncaring, right? So be sensitive to the way in which the problem is being framed. But then I want to offer a second suggestion, and that is you need to remember who it is that bears the burden of proof. Here is the general rule. He who makes the claim bears the burden to demonstrate the truth of that claim. For example, I could claim that watermelons are actually blue on the inside until you cut the skin. But until, once that skin is broken, it turns red. But up until that point, it's blue. Is it your job to disprove what I've just said? It's not. I'm the one who's made the claim. So I'm the one who needs to demonstrate that that claim is true. Well, in exactly the same way, in this situation, when the skeptic is raising the problem of evil, they are the ones who are making the claim. Namely, that the coexistence of God and evil is either impossible or else improbable. That is their claim. It's not your job to disprove it. It's their job to prove it. In other words, at this point, it's the Christian's turn to sit back and be skeptical. Try to poke holes. Because if the argument isn't sound, if the conclusion doesn't follow, then the objection isn't a good one. And it shouldn't bother you, and it shouldn't bother the person that you're talking to. So with those preliminary aspects out of the way, let's first lay out what would be called the logical problem of evil. This is the stronger form of the argument, and the reason that it's stronger is because it tries to show that the existence of God and the existence of evil is actually impossible, that they cannot coexist. That would be to say that the atheist or the skeptic needs to formulate some argument that has premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, so on and so forth. Therefore, God does not exist. That is the burden that the atheist must bear. To give you probably the most popular formulation, I want to give you an excerpt from David Hume, a very influential atheistic philosopher of the previous century. He says, quote, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then comes evil?" Now, at first glance, this seems like a fairly formidable argument. It seems like the theist has really been painted into a corner. However, upon closer inspection, the argument becomes a little less defensible. let's take premise 2, that if God is able and willing, or able but not willing, then he is malevolent. Is that really true? Say God's able to remove some suffering, but he's not willing to remove that suffering. Is he therefore malevolent? I mean, isn't it possible that God might just have a good reason for allowing that suffering? Is that possible? Or to put it in the way that Alvin Plantinga has stated it, he says, Plantinga being one of the foremost Christian philosophers of the last century, he says in his book, God, Freedom, and Evil, quote, suppose that the theist admits that he just doesn't know why God permits evil. What follows from that? Very little of interest. Why suppose that if God does have a good reason for permitting evil, that the theist would be the first one to know? Perhaps God has a good reason, but that reason is too complicated for us to understand. Or perhaps he has not revealed it for some other reason. The fact that the theist doesn't know why God permits evil is perhaps an interesting fact about the theist, but by itself shows little or nothing to the rationality of belief in God. Much more is needed for the atheological argument to even get off the ground. You see, Plantinga here is abiding by that second consideration that I mentioned, the burden of proof. Hume has asked some questions, right? Is God able but not willing? Well, then he's malevolent. Plantinga says, you're going to have to demonstrate that. You can't just assume that. You can't just ask that question. You need an argument. And those kinds of arguments have proved to be very difficult to formulate for the atheist or the skeptic. Here's why it's so difficult. Here is the raw material that must be included in this argument. Premise 1, God is all-powerful. Premise 2, God is all-knowing. Premise 3, God is all-good. Premise 4, evil exists. Okay, that's kind of the raw material of this argument. But you'll notice there's no contradiction between those four, right? You can't say premise 1, 2, 3, and 4, therefore God does not exist. By no rules of logic could you reach that conclusion. So what the atheist needs are some additional premises to plug in here, and what we find once we draw those premises start to look pretty weak, pretty indefensible. To give you 2 examples, Plantinga notes that at least one of the assumptions that is required for this argument to get off the ground is that necessarily an all-powerful God can create any world that he wants. That is one of the assumptions that's necessary for this argument to work. So that necessarily an all-powerful God can create any world that he wants. But this is not obvious. It's not obvious that an all-powerful God could just create any world that he wants. Now, if that were true, right, if God could just create any world, well then we'd expect to have a world where everyone is just super happy all the time, having a great time, and everyone is a Christian, and that's the kind of world that we would expect if God could just create any world. But Plantinga says that God can't just create any world that he wants, and curiously enough, he to prove it. Here is how he does it. Suppose that there's this man, Maurice, and he doesn't know exactly what he's going to have for breakfast tomorrow, but he does know that he's only got 2 options. Either there is oatmeal in the refrigerator, or there is cereal in the cabinet, okay? So he can either have the oatmeal, he can either have the cereal, or he can have both, right? So those are kind of the 3 options that are available. Now, here is the critical point to keep in mind. When tomorrow comes, it is the case that Maurice will choose oatmeal, okay? So that is just kind of Maurice's disposition. I disagree with it strongly, but that's just what he's going to do, all right? He is going to choose the oatmeal in those conditions. Okay, now, let's imagine another way that the world might have been. Let's suppose that everything in this kind of, this possible world over here, this possible state of affairs, let's say that everything is exactly the same as it is in the actual world, except there's one difference, and that is that the galaxy Andromeda just has one less planet, okay? But everything else is the same. So there's this one galaxy that has one less planet, but everything else is the same insofar as it concerns the actual world. So in that possible state of affairs, right, there are the same possibilities. Maurice either chooses oatmeal, he either chooses cereal, or he chooses both, right? Those are all possible worlds where you've got the exact same state of affairs minus one planet, and it's possible that Maurice chooses oatmeal, it's possible that he chooses both, and it's possible that he just chooses cereal. Those are all possible states of affairs, ways the world could be. Here's the question. Come morning, given that possible state of affairs, what choice will Maurice make? Oatmeal, right? We've already established that all things being equal, Maurice is going to choose oatmeal. So here's the critical point. Here's the critical move, right? What Alvin Plantinga has just demonstrated is that there are possible states of affairs, right? A state of affairs in which there's one less planet and Maurice chooses cereal, but which God cannot bring about, because Maurice is going to freely choose oatmeal every day of the week. So unless God forces Maurice to choose cereal, Maurice will not choose cereal. In other words, human freedom, free will, is a limiting factor in the kinds of worlds that God can create. Because all things being equal, Maurice will exercise his freedom to eat oatmeal. So unless God intends to violate that free will, he cannot bring it about that Maurice will freely choose cereal, right? Think about the idea of making someone freely choose something. That's a logical contradiction, right? We're talking about square circles here. We're talking about God making a married bachelor. He can't do it. It's a logical absurdity. And God cannot force people to freely choose something. Therefore, God can't just create any world that he wants. Human freedom is a limiting factor. So, if God chooses to make a world with free creatures, then there are all sorts of possible worlds where people make all kinds of choices. Nevertheless, there is only one possible state of affairs that will become actual, since people's freedom will only result in one actual state of affairs. So it just isn't true that God can create any world that he wants. That first assumption is false, and on that basis alone, the argument fails. Christian philosopher William Lane Craig says, for all we know, it is possible that in any world of free persons, with as much good as the actual world, there would also be just as much suffering. And on this basis alone, the atheist's argument fails. But now I want to introduce the second assumption. The second assumption is that an all-loving God prefers a world without suffering. Right? If you take those two assumptions together, that God can create any world that he wants, and that an all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering, well, then you would be able to get to the fact that there would be no evil, right? If that God exists, and then evil would exist, therefore this God would not exist. But you need those two additional premises. So is it true that an all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering? Well, once again, that's far from obvious. After all, isn't it possible that God could have overriding reasons for allowing a certain amount of suffering in the world? We all know of cases in which we permit or even inflict suffering because of some greater good. Has anyone ever been to the dentist? Has anyone ever enjoyed going to the dentist? We understand that sometimes a little bit of suffering is necessary in order to bring about greater goods, right? But it's also sometimes true that some evils are so intimately tied up in some goods that to remove the evil would be to remove the good. For example, think of the formation of the United States of America. Out of what circumstances was America born? Wasn't it not the tyrannical rule of the British Empire? So take away the tyrannical rule of the British Empire. Does America ever form? Not likely, Where's the impetus for it? And so if you remove the evil of the British Empire, then you remove the good of the American nation. And notice, if you remove the formation of the American nation, perhaps everything else in Europe continues on track, and we end up with a second world war, and America is no longer there to rise up to meet that challenge. What happens then? So to remove the tyrannical rule of Britain might be to make way for a greater evil, namely Nazi regime. We just don't know, right? So it's possible that God needs to allow some evil, some suffering, in order to make for greater goods. But then, as I just mentioned, sometimes you need to allow for a little bit of evil in order to prevent a greater evil. Suppose I break my finger, and I go to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh, well, we've got to get this taken care of, right? We've got to eliminate as much suffering as we possibly can. That's what a loving doctor would do, just eliminate all the suffering. So there's this new procedure where we can take your arm off, no pain whatsoever. Let's get that done. We'll get rid of the broken finger. I'm not taking that deal. Why not? Well, because the removal of that little bit of evil will actually lead to a greater evil. Namely, I won't have an arm. So sometimes you need to suffer with a little bit of evil in order to prevent a greater evil from occurring. So therefore, it just isn't the case that God will always prefer a world with no suffering. Such worlds might be equivalent to a padded room, right? A bubble wrap on the walls. Think of a parent that never allows their child to go outside for fear that they might get hurt. So they just keep them inside, right? And they're always wearing elbow pads and helmets. You know, that child will probably never suffer. But they will miss out on so many other greater goods. Perhaps it is that God just isn't interested in putting us in a padded world because it would rob us of much greater goods. For this reason, the logical problem of evil has been largely rejected by atheist philosophers. In fact, if you talk with any atheist philosopher today, they will basically say the problem of evil, from a logical standpoint, is dead. And so that's not typically run anymore. What the atheists have decided to do then is to run a weaker argument, which says that the coexistence of God and evil is not impossible, it's just improbable. So the argument has been amended. And so this argument would look like this. God is all-loving, all-knowing, all-good. We got that out of the way. So long as it involves no logical impossibility, like making free creatures do things, God can create any world that he wants. Okay, so that's an acceptable amending of the premise, right? So God can't do logically impossible things, but just so long as it's logically possible, then God can do things. Of all these logically possible worlds, God would want to create the best logically possible world. Okay? And then given the evil in the world, this is probably not the best of all logically possible worlds. Therefore, God probably does not exist. So once again, it seems to me that we could challenge some of the premises here, specifically premise 3 and 4. Premise 3 said that God would prefer to create the best of all logically possible worlds. Here's the criticism that I would offer. Perhaps it is that there is no best logically possible world. For example, let's just think of a world in which everyone is deliriously happy all the time, right? That might not be logically possible, but let's just run with that. Let's say there were 1 million people on the planet that were just deliriously happy all the time. What might make that world better? What about 1,000,001 people that were deliriously happy all the time? Okay, well, let's do that then. Let's have God create that world. Okay, well, what would make that world better? What about 1,000,002 deliriously happy people all the time? You can see where this is going, right? You can always add one more person, and then when the earth fills up, you just make another earth, and when that earth fills up, you just make another earth. There is no upper limit here. It just continues on. And so at some point, God just has to cut it off, right? And say, well, you know what? This is the world that I'm going to choose. There may not even be a best logically possible world. And like I said, that's not very plausible. So perhaps it is that this much happiness requires this much suffering. And so God creates a world with this much happiness and this much suffering. Well, it seems like that might be a little bit better if we could get this much happiness with only this much suffering. But it would be even better if we could get this much happiness with only this much suffering. You see where this is going, right? There is no cutoff point. So perhaps it is that this is the best of all logically possible worlds, and we're just dealing with the necessary amount of suffering. We just haven't been able to observe all of the good that will come later. Perhaps that is the case. But it's just not obvious that there even is a best logically possible world. But a more cutting criticism is from premise 4, that this world is probably not the best of all logically possible worlds. Against this, William Lane Craig offers 3 criticisms. First, we are just not in a good position to say that it is improbable that God has good reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. Now, the key element here is the limitations of our own observational and cognitive abilities, right? Are we really warranted that because much of the evil that we observe seems to us to have no explanation, that therefore it has no explanation? Well, I don't think we're really in a good position to know. We are limited in time and space and knowledge and wisdom. God, on the other hand, would not be. So here's an illustration. Any of you ever watched the movie It's a Wonderful Life? Well, in that movie, there is this man that is fairly miserable, and he thinks that life would just be better if he weren't part of it. And so there is this figure that shows him what life would be like if he were not in it. And everyone around him then becomes miserable. He was key to the goodness that resulted in everyone else's life. That person had no idea. He would have never known. He didn't have the tools necessary to be able to make that determination. Given the dizzying complexity of life, we are simply in no position to judge with any sort of confidence that God has no good reason for permitting some instance of suffering to afflict our lives. All right, and this is recognized even by unbelievers. There is an ethical theory called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism says that we ought to do what will result in the greatest good for the greatest number. So you just weigh, okay, will this choice create the greatest good for the greatest number? If so, you do it. If not, you don't do it. Here's the problem. One of the fatal criticisms of utilitarianism is you can't know what will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. You might think that this will produce the greatest good, but it could blow up in your face. Or you might think that this is fairly inconsequential, and it results in the best outcome possible, right? Good thing that's never happened to someone here, right? Where you thought you were doing the right thing and it blew up in your face. That never happens anymore. We're just not in a good position to know. But then secondly, Craig observes that relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence is actually probable. See, probability is always with respect to some background information. That's how probabilities work. So, for example, suppose I tell you that I went to college, and you know, just because, that 90% of college students drink beer. And so you think, wow, there's a high probability, given the background information that this person went to college, that this person has drank beer. But then suppose you find out that where I went to college was the Bear Valley Bible Institute, in which no students drink beer. Well, now it is highly improbable that I drank beer while in college, right? So probabilities always depend on background information. So when the atheist says, therefore, it is improbable that God exists, you need to ask the question, improbable with respect to what? If it's just with respect to the evil in the world, well, yeah, you might come to the conclusion that it's improbable. But what about all the good in the world? What about God's existence with respect to that? What about God's existence, the probability of God's existence, with respect to various arguments in favor of God's existence? What about the probability that God exists with respect to the facts concerning the resurrection of Jesus that we talked about this morning? See, when you take the full scope of evidence, God's existence, far from being improbable, starts to look very probable. And then, third, Christianity actually entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and the suffering in the world. We'll have to go through these very quickly. But this is to say that on Christianity, there are certain doctrines that are taught that would actually make you think that we ought to expect suffering in a world in which God exists. These doctrines would include, firstly, that the chief purpose of our life is not happiness, but rather the knowledge of God. A lot of people, when they approach the problem of evil, have the assumption that God's whole purpose for creating us was just to create this little terrarium for his human pets, right? And what do you do when your pet is suffering? You try to help it, right? You always want your pet to be happy. So God must always want us to be happy, right? God didn't create us to be happy. He created us to know him. And so a world that was geared toward making us happy might actually result in far less knowledge of God. Is it just coincidental that the greatest increase in the numbers of Christians around the world just so happened to be in the places where they experienced tremendous persecution? Mao's China, El Salvador, Ethiopia, places that are terribly hostile to Christianity, ravaged by civil war. Those are the places where the gospel is spreading. Why? Perhaps it is that suffering causes us to want to know more about God. Second doctrine is that mankind is in a state of rebellion against God. Romans 1 will talk about God giving us up to our own desires. That's taught by Christianity. And so we would expect a world with tremendous amounts of moral evil. But then third, God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but rather spills over into the next life beyond the grave, where all things will be made right. These kinds of doctrines entail a world that have suffering. And notice, these don't have to be true, right? The skeptic doesn't have to believe them. But this is, nevertheless, what Christianity teaches. And so if the skeptic is arguing against the Christian God, then they've got to show not only that his argument is sound, but that these doctrines are false. It's not your job to prove them true. You are the skeptic. He's making the claim. So let's bring this to a conclusion. We've talked about the intellectual problem, but oftentimes, when you deal with the intellectual problem, you will find the emotional problem lurking beneath. And so when the intellectual problem is stripped away, you find yourself in the position of needing to offer support or counsel or help with this person's emotional state. And at this point, it is perhaps best to merely listen, right? Think of the suffering that Job was enduring, and the one good thing that his friends did. The one good thing that Job's friends did was close their mouth for 7 days. That was the best thing they did the whole time. You don't need all of the answers. You just need to be there. Just be there. Support them. But it might also be appropriate to offer some encouraging words. For example, Christianity tells us that God is a loving Heavenly Father who shares our hurts and who suffers along with us. But it goes further than that. Not only does our Father in heaven suffer with us, he actually suffered for us. Jesus' death on the cross was a truly horrific event. Why would Jesus put himself through that? For you. For us. To give us everything that he gave up. And then as Christians, we have several advantages in dealing with suffering. We know that our suffering isn't in vain, but that God can work it for good. We know that the glory to come far outweighs any suffering that we might endure in this life. And we know that we have possession of something far more valuable than a pain-free life, and that is the knowledge of him. Those are advantages that the unbeliever doesn't have access to, but nevertheless, we as Christians can take full advantage of. And so ultimately, the answer to the problem of evil is not so much a syllogism as it is a person. The divine person of Jesus, who suffered with us, but ultimately suffered for us in order to produce the greatest possible good, the eternal fellowship with our Father and Creator. It is ultimately Jesus who answers the problem of evil. Thank you for your attention.